started with no heart and no love to give. I tried and not tried alone. So cold and no trust and no hope. We both know when trust is broke, it's time to go. Could have been another way, caught up in the dumbest things. Didn't want to entertain being here in the way. Fighting every day like it's necessary, breathing. Adding up the right and wrongs, trying to keep it even. Every difference of opinion didn't help, they were reasons. And every time we got to yelling, someone's always leaving. Maybe we weren't meant to be, couldn't handle mentally. Or maybe you were meant to leave, but I'm just matching energy. I wish I was your everything, I wish I had a remedy. Wish that we could work it out instead of being enemy. I'm sorry I ain't sorry, or I wasn't what you wanted. I try to keep it 50-50, but I'm better at 100. So close but so far and so on we must go. Goodbye and so long, I'm sorry but no more.
Good afternoon. Welcome to the Philadelphia Asian American Film Festival live stream. My name is Claire Nguyen. I go by she, her, and they, them pronouns, and I'm a current senior at Penn and co-chair of the Penn Asian American Studies Undergraduate Advisory Board. I'm delighted to moderate today's panel, Race and Education Access. This panel will be around an hour and a half, and we'll have some opportunity to take audience questions at the end of the panel. So we'd love to hear from y'all. Please feel free to leave any questions or comments in the comments section. Though we are currently conducting this panel in a virtual space, we would like to begin with a land acknowledgement. The Philadelphia Asian American Film Festival hosts its events on unceded Indigenous territory known as Lenapehoking, the homeland of the Lenni Lenape. These are the people who negotiated with William Penn in the 1680s to facilitate the founding of the colony of Pennsylvania. Their descendants today include the Delaware Tribe and Delaware Nation of Oklahoma, the Nanticoke Lenni Lenape, the Ramapo Lenape, Powhatan Lenape of New Jersey, and the Munsee Delaware of Ontario. Today's panel will take a closer look at the narratives in Try Harder to reveal how race, higher education, and educational access intersect by understanding the context of Lowell High School's position in the San Francisco School District and thinking through the ways in which Philadelphia's public school system reflects and differs from what we see in the film. I wanted to first thank PAF, especially Casey Huynh and Selena Yip, for inviting me to moderate and to share this wonderful space with these amazing educators, organizers, and advocates. With that, I'd like to turn it over to our panelists, Annie Fan, Ania Moore, and Jung Lee. Thanks for joining us, y'all. Would y'all be able to introduce yourself by sharing what were some of your own educational experiences as a BIPOC student, and how did that inform your interest in education and becoming an advocate for students? Anyone can just start us off.
I can go first. So hi everyone, my name's Ania, she, her, hers. I grew up in Philadelphia. I am a proud Philadelphia public school kid. Not because I believe that, and I'll get into this throughout the panel, not because I believe that the district is doing like an amazing job, but just because like I met a lot of amazing people through the public school district. Unfortunately, they're not the ones that have the power. I grew up in Southwest Philadelphia specifically and went to a little school named Penrose that was very poor, mostly predominantly African American, before moving on into the city's top magnet school, Masterman High School, for 5 years for high school and 8th grade. Then I went to Penn, and I'll get into all of this. So I'm rushing through my education a little bit. Had to navigate sort of kind of the world to being like, you know, a first generation low income student from a Black background in a predominantly white institution. The college application process was terrible. I coached kids through it. And then through a lot of luck and a lot of hard work, I was granted a Rhodes Scholarship my senior year at Penn, then I studied at Oxford for 2 years. My graduation is actually a week from now on next Saturday. And so this is the end of my current educational journey.
I can go next. My name is Jung. Again, go by he, him, his. I'm a former youth project director with Lead, an organization that I co-founded. I'm currently on sabbatical, so thanks for having me on. And I'm actually an immigrant from Vietnam. I'm ethnic Chinese, grew up in Vietnam and came here in 2008 with my parents and my brother. And I got enrolled in also a very underfunded neighborhood school, South Philadelphia High School. When my mom's friend, who also happened to live here, helped my mom enroll me and my brother into the school. And immediately there was like a lot of things that kind of like informed, I guess, or changed the way that I viewed, U.S. the U.S. as like a whole, right? Like before coming here, there's a lot of like dominant narrative about, oh, the U.S. is like in a first world country where like resources is like abundance and all of that, right? I think it's something about like, oh, every house has like a swimming pool. I don't know where I got that kind of like thing from, but like, oh yeah, excited for swimming pool. There's no swimming pool anywhere in my neighborhood. But going to South Philadelphia High School as like a neighborhood school with like I think again resources being deprived right every single day, and like there's like a lot of like tension within the student body, and there's a lot of like kind of like structural violence like perpetuated by the school staff, right? Reinforced, normalized by the school staff, but also by the school administration and also by the school district, right? So like I went through like I think 3 years of high school experiencing anti-Asian, xenophobic, physical violence, right? But also again strategic deprivation of resources from the state, the city, and the school district itself. Things like school closures, like $700 million of school budget being taken away from Philly by the state in 2011, right? Increase in surveillance, decrease in support resources, and all of that. So pretty much like that kind of like informed, how I am right now, because of the school failure in protecting the students, that they let like a huge kind of like the Black Asian student relationship get worse over time, and then like cultivated in like culminated in like a huge fight in my junior year in high school, where like a lot of Asian students were like attacked, by the Black students, and then kind of the school failed to really ensure the safety of all students and just like added on into that. And that kind of really activated and politicized me and opened my mind in terms of like, oh shit, sorry. What is the goal of like, me as like a young person at that time? And because originally I was like, I just wanted to go to school and graduate and that's it. But now I was like, can I afford to do that, right? Because it's just not the question of like who is enacting the violence, the interpersonal violence, but like who structurally has allowed for this condition to happen where Black and Asian students like cannot get along. Like it is definitely a structural issue, right? And so that really opened my eyes to do a lot of that. And also I graduated from South High to also to go to Penn as well. And I can talk more about it in the classroom, so that's I'm rambling a little bit. But yeah, that really informed like why I've been doing like work with high school students for the last 8 years. Yeah, I'll pause there.
I think it's my turn, right? Hi, everyone. My name is Annie Fang. I use she, her, they, them pronouns. I'm really excited to be here. Maybe just a quick snapshot of my background, and I guess we call it our educational journey, but really like oftentimes it's more of like a credentialing journey, like from like a young age. So as like I'm currently an educator, so I'm just thinking a lot about the difference between learning, between school and getting degrees, right? And we conflate those things. So maybe just a quick snapshot of all of that. I was born in Orange County from a young age after the Rodney King riots. My parents were kind of startled by, rising cost of living, perceived violence against, Vietnamese American communities. My father was a refugee from Saigon. My mother married him later and also moved over from Vietnam. we moved to Albuquerque, New Mexico, which has a pretty different racial and ethnic context than California. And so I grew up in Albuquerque, attended 3 different public elementary schools, following my dad wherever he was stationed as a mail carrier, making sure that we were kind of able to be close by. In 5th grade, my mother had me apply to private schools, and on financial aid was able to, you know, attend a private school from 6th through 12th grade. And I think from there, at a very early age, was kind of anxious about race and class and all of these things, even before I could fully articulate it. It ended up, being the token Asian American. There was only one other Asian girl in my school, like in my grade. And then I was the only Vietnamese girl in the entire school for a really long time until my sister came along. And, we were constantly anxious about the state of money to be able to afford to go there, because it, to me, felt contingent on my educational success. So was really grappling with, anxiety, depression, other things that had come in, came to light that as I got older. I think it's really important for me to name that I am like a survivor of sexual violence and abuse, and this was something that happened in childhood. So this was something also impacting my educational journey as I was navigating these spaces. Became activated as a young high school person, really excited about education, ethnic studies, social justice. For me, that saved my life. Was able to kind of explore education across the city of Albuquerque through those experiences, and kind of push myself beyond the private school experience. From there, had my own interesting journey into Stanford, being the first in my family to go to college, and carrying all the joys and burdens of that. Chose to continue my degree there in comparative studies in race and ethnicity and English with a poetry emphasis. Knew I wanted to be a teacher pretty early on, which was so exciting. So since then, I've been teaching in San Francisco Unified School District, and just recently this fall, I've decided to continue my credentialing process with a degree in social justice leadership at Santa Clara University. So I'm receiving a Doctor of Education, hopefully in 2024.
Thank you all for sharing a bit about your credentialing journey. I really like that phrase, Annie. I think to start talking about the film, Annie, I'm really curious if you could tell us more about San Francisco and the San Francisco School District and how Lowell High School is situated there. Try Harder shares a lot of stories from Lowell students, specifically the stories of Asian American students. So I'm curious to hear more about that and sort of your reflections from teaching in the school district for the past 6 years.
Yeah, I've been, and this is my 5th year of full-time teaching. I started my student teaching year there, though, so it's been 6 years overall in the district. I guess I want to start by making a little bit of a qualifier in that I'm only one person in this very, very large district, and that I don't think I can capture the whole experience. So I just wanted to name that. I think if you've ever listened to the New York Times podcast, Nice White Parents, then a lot of what is happening in San Francisco will feel familiar to you. As someone who did not grow up like that, though, when I came into the San Francisco school district, I was like, what is this place? Like, just don't understand it at all. Because when I grew up, my public school experience was you just went to your neighborhood school, right? There were zones. You went to the one in your neighborhood. It was pretty much that easy. My parents applied for transfers because my dad had to work in different places. So they wanted me to close in case anything would happen. And I thought that's just how it went down. All of my friends who went to public school and continued in public school in New Mexico basically had that journey. Here in San Francisco, parents will talk about what kindergarten did you get into, right? The common question is, what school are you getting into from a very early age, despite the fact that it's the public school system, based on kind of a broken lottery system. So it's semi-lottery, and it's kind of based on a number of factors, including geography, et cetera, et cetera. And they're going through the process of revamping it over the next 5 years. But basically, children don't necessarily go to their neighborhood schools. and that tracks into high school. So, your elementary schools, your middle schools, and they try to keep elementary schools closer or kiddos closer to home. But then as you get farther, by the time you're applying to high school, what's happening is that basically you list like your top choices. Children go and they shadow different schools. And with Lowell, until last year, it was one of the two magnet schools in the district. One was Rufus Alwa School of the Arts, which was an arts magnet. So in 8th grade, you had to prepare an audition or a portfolio to get into their programs. In Lowell, they were basing it on your 7th grade standardized test scores and a number of other metrics. So Lowell, their youth journalism publication, has some really great stuff on how that breaks down. I think I'm losing track of the question, but essentially that's what it is. It's a magnet admissions school, or it was until last year. And I would say that kind of as an educator in the system, and this is not specific to Lowell, but what I think crystallizes through Lowell is that oftentimes there's this conversation around merit. Like, my kid is good enough to get into a school, like they deserve to be in the school that they are. Whereas when you go into a zoning kind of system, it's like, well, it's your neighborhood school, it's close by. But now it's a question of did you work hard enough, or did you navigate the system well enough to get what you wanted or what you deserve? Which ultimately, in my experience, has been an instrument of segregation in the school district and of anti-Blackness in particular, especially given the legacy of gentrification, redlining, and just violence in the city. So those are the things that come to mind, and a really important conversation when we're talking about school admissions, even if it's oh, this is the Asian American experience, is that we still have to be talking about racial segregation that was built on a foundation of settler colonialism, right? San Francisco is on Yalama Ohlone land, and anti-Blackness. So maybe I can pause there and we can build, but those are the things that kind of come in mind when I'm thinking about the larger landscape of San Francisco. Oh, sorry, the other thing is only 11% of the public school district is white. So the vast majority of white children in this city attend private schools. So that's a partition that we also have to think about even before we talk about the public school dynamics.
Thank you. I'm actually, even though I go to school in Philadelphia, I'm actually from the Bay Area. And I think this culture of meritocracy that you're talking about, even though I grew up in the South Bay, so not in San Francisco, I think that is something that is very strongly felt throughout the area. And I have had to do a lot of learning about Philadelphia's own public school system after I moved to the city. Jung and Ania, from what Annie shared, how does the landscape of the public school system in Philadelphia compare to San Francisco? And also maybe what narratives in Try Harder align or don't align with the experiences of the students in Philadelphia?
So I can speak to Philadelphia and some of the similarities for just a little bit. And so I guess just many folks will already know this, but I'm just going to give a quick recap for folks who don't. But similar to the San Francisco school district, Philadelphia is highly segregated, and it is built around which will be one of the themes of this panel, which is resource scarcity in the education system. And resource scarcity in an education system is a capitalist tool to get students who are from any type of disadvantaged background, whether they hold multiple disadvantaged identities or multiple disadvantaged backgrounds, or sometimes even none, but it's a way to get them to compete against each other and to ingrain the meritocracy, the idea of the fake meritocracy that we live in into the minds of youth from a very early age. And so let me break down all that language for a second, right? Because I think that's very important, but I just wanted to give that an introduction. And so in Philadelphia, you have elementary schools that are mostly neighborhood based, but even that's complicated. A lot of my research at Penn, I wrote 2 theses on the segregation of schools in West Philadelphia and how the movement of higher income white parents in particular moving back into the city was actually advantaging some neighborhood elementary schools over others. And so you have schools like, even if it's technically a public school and it doesn't get great resources from the state, or from the city, you still have parents with certain forms of economic, social, and cultural capital that can come in, form PTO boards, and get extra resources for their kids, whether that's through raising money through bake sales, I think is the common sort of kind of narrative in people's minds, and like getting a new library or getting a new playground, or sometimes those parents are better at navigating bureaucratic systems and winning more resources for the school, et cetera, et cetera. And so even with the elementary schools, which are technically are technically neighborhood based, if your neighborhood is of a certain composition, then you either have a certain extra level of resources or a certain level of not resources. And as Annie was saying earlier, a lot of that neighborhood composition has roots in redlining, has roots in historical housing segregation. All of this stuff is mapped together. My master's thesis was written on community development in Philadelphia and comparing Black and white middle class neighborhoods. A Black person in the United States of America is approximately 30% more likely to live in an impoverished neighborhood than a white person of a lower class status, of someone that makes $20,000 less average household income than them. And that's what redlining was supposed to be, right? Like, even for African Americans who were solidly middle class or working class, they were still put in these incredibly under-resourced communities that had a lot of poverty. And so that's elementary schools. But I just wanted to break that down for a second because elementary schools feed into high schools, right? And so in 8th grade, you have, and I'm going to cuss here, sorry, you have what I call the most fucked up process in the world, where you have a bunch of 8th graders. They get 5 high schools of their choice that they can apply to. And there's this booklet that the School District of Philadelphia prints out thousands of a year and gives them to all the 8th graders. And in the booklet, there's each high school, it has a rating for like violence, academics, overall rating. Here's the test score requirements, what they're looking for in terms of attendance. And so from the beginning, the students are ingrained with, oh, well, I could go to a school that's a 9 out of 10, which there are very few of, and I have to compete for that, or most of the schools are like a 3 or 4 out of 10. And so based upon their 7th grade test scores, their past couple of years worth of grades, attendance, they all apply to these high schools. And there are 3 different types of high schools in the city of Philadelphia. There are magnet/special admission schools, which they're changing the name of soon. There are citywide admission schools, which is sort of kind of like the middle rank. And then there are neighborhood schools. And neighborhood schools have the most impoverished children. They have the most English second language learned ESL students. They have the most disabled students, that have a variety of disadvantages. And they have when you have that least amount of when you have students that are incredibly disadvantaged and you're working with the same resources as a school that doesn't work with children of that same type, then your resources have to be stretched a lot farther, and that leads to you being even further under-resourced. And so then all of this sort of kind of wraps into that you have a system of where then when folks apply to college, you have just even more competition in those like magnet schools at the very, very top, which is forgetting a critical portion of kids. And then they're all competing against one another to get into different colleges and whatnot. And sorry, this is like a long ramble. And so I'm going to like try and end it here. But yeah, that's just an explanation of sort of kind of how race and school admissions works without even the college portion, which I'll get to later in the city of Philadelphia. And you can draw some parallels between Lowell as well in terms of the competition, the segregation, the different types of high schools, et cetera, et cetera.
Thanks, Ania. that actually I learned a lot from what you just said too. So I came in 2008, right, to the state in 2008, and that meant like my experience was pretty much like all high school. And I also been only working with high school students. So thank you so much for like adding more of the context of like how the elementary and middle school system work. But all in all, yeah, it is fucked. Kind of like just to add a bit of context too, in terms of like how Philly in particular has been, well, a lot of like I guess like urban school districts across the country, right? Like have been experiencing like kind of like privatization, charterization by like neoliberal takeover from the state and from the cities, right? And very similar in Philly since the 1980s. In terms of like there's a whole thing about like the state passing laws like disbanding like the school board in Philly in the 1980s, 90s, right? And installing this thing called the School Reform Commission, where this five-person board like control like pretty much everything, right, without accountability because they were appointed by the governor, 3 of them, and by the mayor, 2 of them. And not until 2017 that through like a lot years of organizing by the different organizations that we were able to like kick them out. And now like we have still like not democratically elected school board, but it's kind of like a step like kind of like above that, right? Back to like how it was in the 1980s, which is now like a mayor appointed school board of 9 people. But still like they're slightly better, but like after the like still fighting like for like we've been fighting for like the most basic thing, right? I don't know if folks know also like in 2018 like there's a whole like a series of like kind of articles in the Philly Inquirer about like saying how like nearly every single school building in Philly is contaminated with like lead, asbestos, or like a lot of like structural issues like boiler, like gas pipe, like mice, like mold. And the thing is, it's not even new, right? It's not new to a lot of the teachers and a lot of parents and students going there, but like it became like a huge thing that we kind of like, and a lot of like other organizations in Philly like kind of like have been trying to push again to demand for more resources from the city and the state, and to demand the school district to be also accountable for like the money they spend. Because like all of these like things, right? Like school closure, like how the school district actually hired like an external consulting firm to do like an assessment, and the result of which was like the closures of like 11 schools, right? Of like layoff of like thousands of staff, and that's 2011. And 10 years later, we are still feeling the impact of that, right? And most of the, again, I think the School District of Philadelphia, the majority of the student body was Black, Brown, Asian, and immigrant students in general. And so like a lot of these folks, I think 99% of like the student body, pretty much like in the low income working class in the school district. And so like we have had to constantly fight for what I would call like the basement level kind of like demands, like things like can students go to school without being poisoned by lead and asbestos? Can it go to school and have the most basic lunch, right? Can it go to school with like updated textbook that is not from the 1980s? These are like the very basic thing that we've had to like fight for the longest time. And that is like kind of like state of like how it is right now in Philly, right? And I think I also want to make some connection with like the documentary too. And from working with like I don't know how many hundred students for the past 8 years, from like to give us some context, like I've led kind of like after school leadership programs for mostly Southeast Asian high school students. It's for leadership development, right? And that means like a lot of like political education and a lot of like kind of organizing around like different issues, including education itself. And so I have students from like the two, I guess, different school, different like groups, right? And I think Ania like was talking a little bit about like this different type of school. We have students from magnet schools, right? And I think Central, I was watching the documentary. Like, this sounds like Central High, but the very extreme case of it, right? Where students are constantly stretched, like having to juggle between school, family, and their primitive like general joy of just being a teenager, right? And most of whom being taught that college is the goal, right? And like the thing that they should like kind of like spend the high school years like fighting for, right? As in like competing with other students for. And then we also have students from like severely underfunded neighborhood schools like Lowell High, where I went to, and Finesse, where we've been basing our kind of programs off the past 3 years, where there's not enough resources, not enough support, like over severe, like literally just pretty much like I also try deliberately not use the word like I think underfunded as much because they are intentionally deprived of resources, right? I think like I want to shift that also that kind of like language a little bit too, and that's why they are resource deprived, right? They're not only just being underfunded because of the deliberation from the system, right? But regardless of where they go to, magnet school or a public school in Philly, there's a lot of systemic violence from lab and asbestos in school, like I mentioned earlier, to over-policing, to failure of the leadership to ensure safe and enriching education for students. Like everything is about test taking. And I know this is not unique to Philly, right? But also, especially during the pandemic, for the last 20 months, all right, the school district could have done a lot of things to really make sure that the buildings are being clean because there's no one in there, right? So they could have done a lot to make sure that that's, being done, that make sure that student could do like virtual learning like properly. They have failed in like a lot of different ways the last 20 months. And now everything they do is trying to get students to go back to school. And we know they're not ready for that. They have never been ready for any kind of crisis this scale, right? Because the school district has been under constant crisis for the past 20, 30 years already. I think I'll pause there too.
Yeah, thank you all for painting that really clear picture about these two school districts. I'm learning a lot from what y'all just shared. And Jung, I really appreciate your intentional reframing of like from instead of calling these schools defunded to more specifically thinking about how they're being deliberately what was the phrase you used? like deprived, right? Resource deprivation, and also Ania, your discussion of like this idea of like scarcity as well, like there being scarce amounts of things and scarce avenues for access to education in particular ways. And so we have this really clear picture about the school districts and the conditions that students are going to school in. And then we have this thing called college that happens after it. And Try Harder is about that. It's about the process of college admissions for these primarily Asian American students at Lowell High School. And I think when I was watching the film, I sort of reverted to being 17 and applying to college, and a lot of these anxieties came back. And I think that the term college admissions brings up a lot of emotions for a lot of different people, whether or not folks are college going, whether or not they're interested in college. And so I'm curious to hear from y'all why you think that is. Like, what does this say about the landscape of college admissions and higher education more broadly? Ania, would you like to start us off?
Yeah, I can start us off. Sorry about the long pause. I think we were all just like, it's a heavy question, and it's something to think deeply about. I personally paused and had an awkward look on my face because I think similar to what other folks are going to say and what you just said, it takes you back to being that very scared, very sort of kind of low self-confident, low self-esteem, just like so many negative feelings. Like your question is about the feelings, right? Like it's negative, it's not helpful. I say this from the mindset of not just a former 17-year-old doing this stuff, but I also the other panelists know this, but the audience might not. I a month and a half ago started being a college admissions coach where I help kids from a variety of economic backgrounds sort of kind of figure out their admissions essays. And we do pro bono, we do paid. It's nothing like those thousands and thousands of dollars services. It's like $50, like most middle class families can afford it. And if you can't afford it, we do a pro bono review. And so we get a variety of low middle class kids, working class kids, some poor kids that we just want to at my company to be able to help do the college admissions process. And recently there was a big November 1st deadline this past week for a lot of the early decision, early action schools. And a lot of the kids that I was working with, they were nervous and they were anxious. I had kids turning things into me. They were like, I absolutely need this back within the next 24 hours. And so much of my feedback was just, I want you to breathe. And so, because so many of the essays were, I'm trying to show you the shiniest version of myself. When I get the kids' essays, I can see a comment that said, I can see their comments, and it's always, well, I want to be able to stand out from another kid. Like, I want to be able to do this. Like, I have to be the best. And I'm like, I just want you to be you because you is good enough. Like, I guarantee you that you is good enough and you will still be good enough, even if Harvard, whoever, some admissions officer on some day and some morning when they're probably cranky does not admit you to a school or waitlist you to a school, or even maybe if they do admit you to a school. I think so much of the problem with college admissions, and this touches on to what Annie said earlier, is that it is part of the credentialing process, right? And I want to be honest, like I say this to you all as someone who has credentialed the hell out of herself. I graduated from Penn, Phi Beta Kappa, top of my class. I'm a Rhodes fucking scholar. like it's and I say that like I'm saying it to make you laugh, but I also say that because like if it came to a world where credentials weren't important, I wouldn't be a Rhodes Scholar. I don't want to be attached to Cecil Rhodes' names. He was a colonialist that murdered thousands and thousands and thousands of Black people in modern day Zimbabwe and parts of Southern Africa. Like, I would not want to be attached to that in a world that wasn't already inherently problematic in so many different ways. But part of like my credentialing the hell out of myself is giving weight to people, is giving weight to some of the words that I say and some of the things that I do on behalf of my community and low income folks of color, to folks who have historically not cared about them, right? And so this is to all say is that like, so that's the reason why I've credentialed the hell out of myself. That's not the reason why all high school students are necessarily applying to college, but there is this whole idea that I have to have this top credential if I'm going to be somebody, if I'm going to impress somebody, if I'm going to get somewhere. And a lot of that is rooted in white supremacy, right? Like, it's this idea of that like white supremacy isn't only like just like I'm talking like skin color racism. White supremacy is anti-Semitism, it's xenophobia, it's homophobia, it's transphobia, it's all the isms and the obias that sort of kind of that I could sit down and name, but I'm not going to, or many of them, not all of them. And it's all inherently rooted in this idea that we are striving to white richness, straightness, etc. And we are going to enter ourselves into institutions that have historically prescribe to this so we can get a credential, so we can also assimilate and quote unquote be somebody. And that's a false narrative, right? Like, you can go to some of these schools and you can get there and you can still not feel like you belong. I'll be very honest about this. At Penn, I struggled with a lot of suicidal thoughts. I'm still on antidepressants to this very day. I got to take them when I get off. I got to take my daily dose when I get off this call. And so this is turning into a long ramble, but this is all of this to say is that so much of this is based on putting other people down just for the chance, not even the guarantee, the chance at coming up and assimilating into a world that might not even be for you, that once you get there, you might still feel worthless and sad and meaningless. And I say this to you all as somebody who is not only watched other kids through this, but once again, who has credentialed the hell out of herself and who, when she got to Oxford, still wasn't all the way happy and still had to be on my antidepressants and still was managing the weight of the world.
I can connect. Oh, Annie, do you want to go? Thank you, Ania, again for sharing a lot of those experiences of yours. Yeah, I think I mentioned earlier too that like the documentary definitely like gave me a lot of flashback on like what I experienced like I think 11 years ago now when I applied to college, right? Literally I think as like an immigrant kid who barely was like in the US for like 2 years, whose primary thing is like, how did I go to college and graduate from college without debt, right? It's literally my only criterion, right, of like of choosing. And also how do I still stay close to home? And that's why like all the colleges that I applied to was like just in Philly, right? Penn, Drexel, Temple, and I think U Sciences. So like, and I know that a lot of folks for like low income working class like BIPOC students like myself at that time is like the cost of the penance was definitely like a major thing, right? And like going through like feelings of like, oh, do I deserve to go to this school, right? I'm attending like pretty much like a very bad school, right? According to like a lot of the different things. Suffolk High was like ranked one of the worst public high school in Philly, right? Me as like a kid who is going to that school and barely in the state for how many years, like, do I deserve to go to, like, my counselor was like, you shouldn't apply to any hard school. You should just say, go choose like the easiest school to apply to. That was what's told by my counselor, right? But I think like through like a lot of my support from like my community, like I kind of like chose to like apply to all these schools, and Penn was the institution that actually gave me a full ride. And that's why I'm like, I only chose to go to Penn because of the money. Not at that time, I didn't really connect like, oh, Penn, I know it's a hard school to get into. I didn't know like, oh, it's an Ivy League or whatever, right? And again, cost was like the only factor that I kind of like that helped me decide like where I wanted to go to. And going to Penn again, like the first semester, I almost failed a class or two. I feel like this is like a reality check for me too. I was like, oh shit, kind of also like instilling even more of that doubt of like, oh shit, I don't really belong here. What am I doing here, right? I am trying to like be part of like this Asian American community in college on campus, but like it's just like a lot of feelings of isolation because it's very much a class thing, right? Like even like if I could go to like other like Asian students on campus, to me it just feel like a lot of these folks like don't experience like life the same way that I do, right? Not to say that like they don't have their own hardship, but to me it's just like a totally different reality. And talking about like how the college admission process is very white supremacist in a sense, like Ania was talking about, right? I learned also that, right, this whole process of like essays, of like considering like test score, the SATs, ACTs, the extracurricular activities were all created as barriers to prevent pretty much marginalized people from accessing higher education, right? like who were more likely to have resources to like learn how to take tests on like having free time to do extracurricular activities instead of worrying about like, you know, having a job while in high school to support their families, right? Like a lot of class, a lot of race, a lot of different intersectional factors, like, you know, like kind of like intertwining in this whole process. And like I mentioned neoliberalism earlier, right? And it is like very much like a thing, right? Like hyper focus on individual responsibility of like individualistic ideals, like which is the primitive tenet of neoliberalism. Like in the documentary, was students asked to show how they're unique individuals, but also while at the same time going through pretty much the same thing, like, oh, you have to be like 4.0 is not enough. You have to be like more than 4.0 GPA in order to even be considered to go to these schools, right? And to me, I was like, this is like a whole different reality as well. Like, and then everything is about competition, right? It's not, you go to school, you spend 4 years of your high school life mostly like learning how to be the best of the best, just so that you don't end up in like schools that are considered, you know, not as good, right? And then I'm gonna pause, but like the whole thing about the No Child Left Behind policy, right? Like that was like in the 2000s. That also have like made it even harder for like underfunded neighborhood schools and the students there to gain any kind of like resources, because now everything is about like the testing, about the numbers, right? And like about, okay, how you doing well on these tests would determine the resources that your schools would get. But if you're already going to like a very like resource deprived school, what are the resources that you can get in order to do well in these tests, right? And everything is about tests and not about like learning anymore, right? So a lot of these factors kind of like played together to make college admissions like pretty much like a very hellish like process for a lot of the students, especially like low income working class BIPOC students, right? And meritocracy, like, I don't want to talk about it, like it's a freaking myth, right? Like it's about, everything is about your like your talents and whatnot. But again, if you have to worry about like working after school, or worry about like even like and not starving, or like if you have to take care of your family so much, like I don't care how talented you are, right? Like you just don't have the same kind of like support system that like other kids who may come from like a wealthier background like to do, right? So meritocracy is a myth to me, and that it did contextualize so much of like the structural issues that are plaguing our society, like being imposed on us by people in power. I'll stop there.
This is just as a refresher for me, but Claire, would you mind just saying the question one more time?
Yeah, just that, like in reflecting about how college admissions brings up a lot of intense emotions, just like thinking through like why this is the case and what does this say about the landscape of college admissions in higher ed?
Yeah, let me focus on the intense emotions part first. Oh my gosh, I am a really passionate health educator. I had the opportunity to start teaching health ed my second year of teaching, fell in love with it. And for me, I'm like, okay, let's even just start there. And it's like big feelings in our lives in response to stress are so normal, but where are the structures in our educational system for young people to practice, learn, explore those really big feelings, right? Like anxiety, depression, like, you know, high stress, panic, like joy, right? Those things, like socio-emotional learning is still something that I don't believe that the US educational system has prioritized at all. And I think a lot about like one of my mentors, Chris Pepper in the district, and how he is such a staunch advocate for universal like K through 12 health education, making sure that at every level, like we are prioritizing health and wellness within the curriculum, within school spaces, right? Rather than constantly trying to outsource, you know, wellness to, the outside service provider, or like, the outside systems, or the after school program, or here's like a little thing. But really, like, we need to comprehensively revamp how we think about the purpose of school, right? Like, and for me, school is like, these are these communities where these young children get to come together, explore things with each other, which absolutely is like reading and, spatial reasoning and all these things. And it's exploring our feelings. What happens when someone hurts us and we feel anger, right? How do we deal with that really big feeling? What happens when we feel nervous about something and we're scared, right? Like, I feel like in teacher education programs, like even mine, and I attended this Stanford teacher education program, it was like completely lacking, right? In terms of how to support young people, but also even how to support ourselves as educators. Like right now, given the spiraling crisis that Jung has talked about, we're in crisis. And I don't think that the vast majority of teachers were equipped at all to handle what's happening right now in teaching in a pandemic. Teaching in like the constant deprivation of these things and experiencing huge amounts of vicarious trauma. Something that I think about with school segregation is like there's so much focus on like these elite schools, right? And in these elite schools even, and I think it's important to name right now, like just because you have like quote unquote top children, they just have good grades, right? That means they have persistent work habits. That means that they have some degree of support. That means like, they've learned to navigate the system. Like we don't talk about things like suicide rates or suicidal ideations and rates of mental illness at schools like Lowell, right? Even though it's not the only one, but in the whole Bay Area, like you were saying, Claire, it's an epidemic, right? Of like the pressures that this puts on young people. Like it was so bad that in the Palo Alto area, the CDC declared it like a crisis, right? The suicide clusters were so bad, right? So that's like one component of it is like, it's not just like you add like a little homeroom session where you talk a little about your feelings. Like we've got to go big and restructure the space that we have for really big feelings. And so I think about that. And, then, going back to my experiences, like that's not the only anxiety or stressor that young people face, right? Like I said earlier, being a survivor of violence, like sexual violence, was a huge part of me navigating my adolescence. And there were no structures in place for me to deal with that, right? Navigating sexism, like structural oppression, racism, right? The bullying from peers, all those things were real things. And there are not structures in place for us to navigate those together. So by the time that we get to college admissions, we're trying to contextualize like our very complicated, beautiful, joyful, messy adolescent experiences into like a few boxes, like a handful of essays here, a number, another set of numbers, right? And somehow that's supposed to tell someone about who we are and what we've lived up to this point when we have lived so much life by the age of 17 or 18. It's dehumanizing. It's completely dehumanizing, right? So I think for me, when I think about college admissions, and I think I'll skip over talking my experience this time around, I feel really grateful that I'm teaching 8th graders right now, but my former students who I had when they were in health class, when they were in 9th grade, are seniors now, and they're reaching out to me. And I feel just so immensely grateful for the conversations I get to have to them about like, yeah, of course there's stress around it, but they're reaching and they're like, hey, like, what tips do you have, Miss Fawn, for like stress? I'm having some hard time sleeping, right? And like, we can also talk about like, hey, can you write my recommendation letter? Like, I really want you to highlight my commitment to like public health. I have a kid who fell in love with health ed from 9th grade, and she's been really great at promoting wellness in her community. And also had a conversation with a couple of years ago with a young undocumented student. And I was like, we're going to find a place for you where you're going to feel supported. Like the structures in place are also not there for you trying to navigate the system and how complicated it is. And I just want you to be careful with your heart, right? In this process, because oftentimes other people in college admissions are going to be like, share every single struggle that you've ever had to overcome. And so it really proves that your GPA and your number is more special than the other ones because you overcame way more, right? There's something really dehumanizing about how we have to tally up our trauma to prove that we are enough or worth it or deserving. And I was like, that story is yours. Like, we know what you've gone through. We know how you support your mom. Like, I see you, right? And your experience of navigating a very complicated system, that's for you, right? And like, what they're looking for is not necessarily you. They're just looking for you, the application. And we have to like disconnect ourselves. And she was in tears. She was like, yeah, I don't think, sometimes I'm afraid, like I'm trying to prove to them like how hard this all has been. And it's like, no, like that's your truth, right? What you're sharing in the college admissions process is going to be something else. And like, we really have to separate children from the application. So those are my thoughts, I guess.
Thank you, everyone. I think this idea of like needing to package so much of our existence into tiny boxes is really resonating with me. And I think something else that Try Harder really elevates is like the experiences of Asian American students in the college admissions process. And I'm thinking about how one of those boxes is like the Asian box, the dreaded Asian box that like they talk about in the film. There's one scene in the film that sticks out really strongly to me, and it's this one male teacher who's doing some sort of like college readiness workshop, and he like explicitly tells his students, his classroom full of mostly Asian American students, the reason why you're not getting into these elite private universities is because you're Asian, and these country club schools don't want their precious campuses turned into UC Irvine. And Jung and Annie, I'm curious, like, what does this demonstrate about Asian American anxieties about college admissions, and what does that reveal about the Asian American experience more broadly? And what are some implications with how race is packaged in this way on a college admissions, on a college application, and how does that impact students?
I can start. I think, one, it's really important to note that that particular teacher is not Asian American, right? Like, this is a non-Asian American white man telling these young people that their race is one of the deciding factors. Like, no, it can't be like that, right? Two, as a, like, I got to teach as well college and career readiness to ninth grade, I would never, ever, right, say that to young people. That's like also not the approach that we should have to college admissions, right? Like, in teaching in pedagogy, the prevailing model right now is inquiry-based learning, right? So it's more of, at least when I taught college and careers, who are you? What are your values? What do you believe in? And what are your dreams, right? We started there. From there, I was like, okay, what is the path to those dreams? Okay, like, let's map out that chart. Now, if college is a part of it, what are some obstacles in place, right? Let's take a look at like the barriers. Let's see their landscape. Let's see these conversations. Really great things like, there's so many beautiful resources out there, and we talked about like, community college versus a, 4-year college and higher education and all these things. And I think going back to Asian American identity, it's such a narrow vision of who Asian Americans can be, right? Like, and even Lowell in this particular scene is a bubble, because it's not the only Asian American majority school in San Francisco. And the experiences that were reflected are real in the documentary. They're also not what I've seen as an educator, right? Like, I'm thinking of, my Filipino students who are like DJing and making music and striving for these things. And so I'm also thinking about Asian American disaggregation, right? The how colonialism impacted our, like, countries of origin, our family's country of origin, our immigration stories, whether refugee status plays in citizenship, right? Undocumented Asian students as well is something on my mind when I'm thinking about this. But I'm thinking about, one girl in my health class who like definitely just wanted to be an esthetician, came in, Asian American girl with the big lashes, right? And like wanted, and that was like her thing. I was like, yes, girl, like be an influencer. Like, why is that not just as valid? Do I really have to like shoehorn college into that thing when, like, let's talk about your skills. Let's talk about like entrepreneurship, right? Like, she will know when she's ready, whether college admissions or college applications or like trade schools is a part of that journey. if I give her the space and time and resources to think that through. So I think that it's just, I worry a lot about immediately like only focusing on this like little corner of the world where we're thinking about Asian Americans and college applications rather than Asian Americans and their extremely diverse experiences and their lived lives. And what about a gap year? And what about like, you know, saving money, because money was also the driving factor in how I applied. And so many of my students are like, I'm going to take CCSF classes for a couple of years. I feel ready to do that. And then I'm going to see what happens after that. And I feel prepared for the next step. And I've seen many of them persist on into Berkeley, into Davis, into Irvine, right? And here in California. So I think that it's just so limiting to talk about Asian Americans in the context of only college when we live such complex, diverse lives.
Thank you, Annie. Yeah, just a few things to add is how I think just back to this whole thing about like college, going to college, like going to like a prestigious college is the goal, right? Like how that has been perpetuated as like the dominant narrative and has been ingrained in a lot of like our folks' minds, like parents, right? Like especially also like immigrant refugee parents who have had really horrible like experiences in their homelands coming over, sacrificing a lot of things, for their children, and then like but at the same time buying into this myth of meritocracy and like the model minority myth and be like, we work hard, we try hard, we will succeed regardless, right? And how that has done a real like how that has really impacted negatively, like to like what Annie mentioned earlier about the mental health of the students, but also perpetuate a lot of like anti-Black, kind of like ideals, like imageries in a lot of these parents' minds as well, right? So how we don't want to be like those people. We have to be try harder. We have to work harder. Yes, we may be poor, but like one day if we go to a good school, that would change, right? Like the whole thing about how Americans actually more invested in like billionaires than like like our fellow working class people. Like how like the system has done such a good job that like we have just bought into to all this propaganda like that. And also thinking about like how yeah, a lot of this is talking about Asian American. I don't know. I've been like the past 2 years, the term Asian Americans. I'm like, I don't know. Do I identify as Asian? It's such a like a loaded kind of like identity. It's like, what do we mean by that, right? The evolution of this kind of like racial category and how like it doesn't it does serve like a purpose, right? But not does it still, right? And like is it doing more harm than good, like when it comes to that, right? And like even within this whole label Asian American, like where do Southeast Asian students fit into this, right? With so unique and like particular histories, socioeconomic backgrounds, right? And again, within the Southeast Asian label, there's like even like West Viet students versus Laotian versus like Khmer versus like Hmong, all of this, right? And then let's talk about class, right? Within that, like, oh, just because you are Asian and because of the model minority myth and how it perpetuates this kind of like image of like Asian being, successful and whatever, like where do low income like Asian folks fit into this picture? And so I think it just, I don't know, it just, this whole, I just feel like we, not just feel like, I know that like Asian folks that have been used as like a racial wedge, to kind of like, how do we call it? As like a tool, like for white supremacy to kind of like again divide and conquer and like and even within the Asian American label, there's still a lot of like complexity, that like so many nuances that are not being highlighted when it comes to this, right? And I'm not sure where I'm going with this, but I was just like it's just hard to just talk about this without all the context, without all of the nuances that we have to also take into consideration, of like the ethnicities, of the histories, the cultures, and the class, and there's also like Black Asian folks, and it's just like, where do they fit into this picture? And so, and college admission is a racist, sexist, ableist process that is like just reinforces and perpetuates the same system that has been harming our people.
Yeah, thanks, Jung. Thanks, Annie. Yeah, I think this panel is called Race and Education Access. So would love to hear all of your reflections on how race, college admissions, and educational access intersect more broadly. I think y'all have talked a lot about it already, but I'm curious if there are other reflections that y'all have about the intersection of these things. Ania, would you want to start us off again?
Yeah. So yeah, this is sort of kind of a broad question, and I guess instead of answering it sort of kind of very broadly, I'd like to focus sort of kind of my response, I guess, on a particular sort of kind of instance. I think, I am the only non-Asian American person on this panel. And I think an important story that I really want to tell coming into this was that I remember my senior year of high school. There were these two best friends. One was an East Asian student applying early decision or early action, whichever one it was, to Columbia, and one was a Black student applying early action, early decision to Columbia. And my high school was not just a high school; it was also a middle school. So you came in at 5th grade, and then you left in 12th grade, and so you have been together your entire childhood. And these two girls were very, very close, and then early decisions came out, and the Black student got into Columbia and the East Asian student did not. And I remember they got into this really bad fight where basically the East Asian student was like, you got in because you were Black. Like, I don't think you're that good of a student. I don't, blah, 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 blah. And the Black girl bought me up and she was like, well, Ania just got in a pen. What do you think about that? And she was like, well, Ania is a good student and she deserved to get in the pen, but you, da, 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 da. And it was this whole sort of kind of just conflict. And when I think about college admissions and race and being on, this panel with so many great Asian Americans and great Asian American allies in the fight against systemic racism and white supremacy, that story just comes to mind because that was an instance of two little girls, a Black girl and an Asian American girl that had grown up together for years. And the college admissions process had managed to drive a wedge, a white supremacist wedge in between them and to separate them. And that, when I really reflect on it, is I think perhaps one of the most telling stories of all. And I should add that I don't necessarily blame the East Asian girl. She was a child at the time. She thinks very differently now. I still know her, still good friends with her, for how she was thinking at the time, because she was a child that had grown up in a certain system, that had been taught certain things, and that a certain type of mentality had been ingrained in her, of this idea of resource scarcity once again, and of me needing to have access. And I think the layer I'm not adding on to this, that the East Asian girl was also lower income while the Black girl was middle class. And so there's a whole nother class layer onto this that I'm not even talking about right now, right? And I think when I really, really think about the college admissions process, I think it causes me to reflect on how there are so many different systems across this country and across the world. And this is just one of them that is really meant to divide and conquer. That the fact of the matter is that I grew up in Philly with a lot of low income Asian American folks in my hood surrounding me, who were great folks, great people. One of the first East Asian Americans that I can remember meeting is a woman who ran a corner store across the street from my grandma's house in West Philly. And she used to keep pictures of all the Black kids in the neighborhood that graduated or that went to prom on her cash register. And I'm talking like when I was 8, I went up there and there were hundreds of pictures. Like everybody used to bring her a picture. And when I imagine like sort of kind of good, sort of kind of just community, not even allyship, like let's forget the activism for a second, but just good community among, you know, Hispanic Americans, Asian Americans, Black Americans, Native Americans, et cetera, all folks of color. I always think of her, and I think how over the years, these different schooling systems and other systems have really divided a wedge. And the fact of the matter is that by 2050, the United States will be a majority minority country. And so all of this is an attempt to lessen our power and to make us fight against each other. So we do not have enough power when we are quite literally the majority in 30 years. And all of this it's just meant to keep people down. It's just a divisive web that's meant to disrupt our power that we could have with each other. And the college admission system is part of that.
I think going off of that, Annie, I really appreciate that story and how you were using the term divide and conquer, because I think what college admissions does is that it also justifies racial segregation all the way down, right? Like within like the K-12 system as well, right? Going back to what we were saying about elementary schools and even that process that of it already being pulled apart, right? Like in order to get into the best college, you have to be in the best high school, which means you have to be in the best middle school, which means you have to be in the best elementary schools, right? And like we will fight over whatever scarce resources we have as neoliberalism is defunding and depriving public education or education at large, right? So, you know, then you have affluent families moving into private schools, and then you have these like magnet schools that are created, and then those are divided, and then the justification is to basically like permit the realities of physical violence, right, upon certain schools, because you've defunded them to the point where they don't have supports for huge amounts of community trauma, right? So then that's enacted through physical violence in the community, oftentimes like in like schools that are Blacker in population, browner in population, depending on your racial metrics. And then it becomes again like another driving wedge to be like, well, I wouldn't want to put my kid in a violent situation. So obviously I'm going to track in the other direction and make sure that they get through a good school. And it's like every school should be good and safe and, you know, where a place like every child feels like they can belong, where they get everything that they need in order to be well. And then learn how to do things like to dig deep and run for their dreams, which sometimes may or may not include college, right? Like, so I think it's so fraught because, and I honestly think like talking a lot about the children of like going through it, but oftentimes a lot of the anxiety comes from parents and caregivers. Being afraid for the safety of their child, right? My mother and I fought a lot my junior year of high school because she was an immigrant and she saw how unsafe the world was for her, for people who looked like us as Southeast Asians, for, you know, the children of refugees, for what her refugee friends had gone through. So she was constantly pushing me and pushing me and pushing me into choices that didn't feel like mine, because she wanted to make sure that I was safe, right? And I was through the process of that being made to feel unsafe by my own mother, not even through her fault, right? These were structures that put us at odds with each other, and it took a long time for me to mend a relationship with myself and my healing so that I could see the whole story of like my mother and what she was going through. And a lot of times I think adults bring their anxieties into this and there's no space for that either. Yeah, and I think I'll pause there.
Thank you, folks. I think the only thing I would add with this is I think like how do we really look at this as like beyond like individuals, right? And for sure, like it's important to like recognize like how like there's a lot of needs unique to each person, each student, and each family, right? How it's so different, like socially, economically, like politically, and like depending on like who you are racialized as, and what class and economic SES you're from, right? And at the same time, how do we also like look at this as like a whole system, right? Like exposing the dominant narrative, right? Like how like higher education is only part of the system of channeling resources from the poor to the rich, of like allowing the rich and the powerful to maintain their power and wealth, right? Of creating an illusion of like upward mobility, creating exceptions where like like folks from lower income backgrounds could climb up the ladder and call it meritocracy, right? And I think, yeah, so like I feel like at this point, this whole system is just like with all the debts that like students are accumulating right now every single year, trillions upon trillions of dollars, right? Who's profiting from all of this? And even all of that aside, right? Like we don't talk enough about like also the how and the what being that students are being taught at these higher education institutions, right? Are they being taught things that kind of like again perpetuate the same system, or are they like being exposed to like counter narratives that could help them make informed decisions about like how they want to who they want to be, and after college, like because a lot of this is just like from K to 12 to like higher education is a lot of like a whole pipeline of like producing obedient workers, right? Of like creating like people who would not question like the system. And I think there's a reason why like it is set up the way it is right now. And I think like and I know like we know this, right? I think like just like how do we make it so that like I don't know, it's like where like the individual needs like can still be met, and at the same time we constantly question the legitimacy of like this so-called higher education system in the U.S. I'm also rambling again, so I'll just pause there.
Yeah, thank you all for sharing. Maybe as like a last like prepped question for this panel, I'd love to hear from y'all. How can educators, schools, and communities prepare their students for college readiness, success, or even failure? Yeah, I think I'm wondering what advice you would give to folks out there who are thinking about their young people right now.
I'll start. I think one, we in this society, we put so much emphasis on the stakes, and the stakes are so high, right? The stakes are incredibly high in many ways. But the reality is that failure, mistakes, messing up is like a natural part of life. Not getting what we want is a thing that we have to experience every day at every stage. And we've created these narratives around certain moments in our life where young people or anybody feel like I cannot fail. There's no option for failure. And the reality is that failure is a neutral circumstance, right? Sometimes you want something and it just doesn't work out. And I think that that's one of the first things that I personally feel like I have to craft in my classroom, and especially have to emphasize when I'm talking about things like college admissions with young people. It's like, okay, what do you want to be when you grow up? I don't do that anymore. It's like, what are your values and what values do you want to live out when you're an adult, right? Who are you? Because you already know your values as a young person. And in 10 years, what values do you want to be living out? Young people say things like creativity, right? Community, things like that. I'm like, okay, so let's go through the process of exploring that, right? And if they want to be things like, oh, love hearing, like, so something that's also really beautiful is like the joy that comes out when you give young people an opportunity to name their purpose in the college admissions process. But they'll tell you, like, I want to be a doctor because I want to help out my community. And I'm like, okay, yeah, let's do that, right? That journey is going to have so many hurdles. Like, don't feel discouraged. That's just how it is. Every journey has hurdles, right? So I think one thing that we can do is to normalize and make so much space for failure and for mistakes as just a very natural part of life. And then two, to highlight the necessity, like not just like the perks, but the necessity of joy, like in the process, right? I want you to what is successful if not to be joyful, if not to be healthy, right? So for me, why would I sacrifice every single ounce of your joy and health right now in order to make you successful so that you can be joyful and healthy later on down the line? When you look at young people, a lot of my friends love my Facebook updates because I'll share these like goofy little stories of young people just living their lives. High school and middle school can be just such a beautiful place where people are exploring relationships and creating things and making memories. And I don't want them to lose sight of all of that joy just because we made a metric. So I think that the other thing is that all of us need to rewire ourselves to be like, how do we identify, name, and make a lot of space to recognize joy when we see it, especially in young people, because that's the thing that we're trying to foster for them for the rest of their lives.
I think just to add to that, I can't emphasize sort of kind of the joy aspect enough. I'll share this it's a very important part of my story, but my father passed my February of my senior year of high school. And then 9 months later, my mom passed 2 months into my first year at Penn. And there have been so many moments in the 6 years since I've lost them that I wish I could just go back to middle school and high school and just breathe and slow down and be joyous instead of worrying about, I need to get in the pen or whatever and like do this because like literally I got in the pen and 2 months later my dad passed. I went to pen and 2 months later my mom passed. And so if I spent so much time wishing to get that admissions letter, wishing to start on that campus. And then those two big goals came with big sacrifices or big tragedy. And so the meeting of my goals for my life personally and tragedy are inherently intertwined. And there are so many moments where I wish I could go back and just find the joy and just have the joy of those moments that were soon to end. And, I'm not saying all your high schoolers that you're working with, their parents are not going to die. That's not what I'm saying. But like, there's just so much for them to enjoy in terms of just like sort of kind of very college admissions focus, more specific guidance. Like I would really encourage everyone out there who's working with a high school student to start to demyth the college admissions process one student at a time. I know so many great people that went to state schools, local schools, etc., that went on to do very amazing things. My partner who's sitting upstairs, my mother-in-law, went to a small state public school in New York, and she is now the chief diversity at Visa. She is the only Black person and one of the only women in the C-suite at Visa. She did not go back for her graduate degree. And she has done, not saying that, Visa is something to strive for necessarily, but really I'm saying that's what she strived for. And she was still able to accomplish it without some super elite degree, et cetera, et cetera. And with, I think my second point is that make sure all of your admissions guidance is really financial aid focused. I absolutely hate it when we coach kids to get into some school that is relatively good and in their mind in terms of admissions, and then they can't afford it. and then all of a sudden they can't like go to the school, and they're sitting there heartbroken after all this hard work. And I'm talking, when I say they can afford it, I mean for all 4+ years. I don't mean for the first year. We have a family cookout, we raise a couple $1,000s, and then they can afford first year tuition, because you're not going to do a cookout every year. I mean, for all 4 years, can the student afford it? Does the student want to have loans and realize what loans are? That's point number 2. And then point number 3, of course, is that college is not meant for everybody. Send kids to certificate schools, cooking school, esthetician school, help them start businesses, get them in mentorship programs, leadership programs. College is not a must. It's not for everybody. And make sure when you're advising equally on the other paths as well.
Well, college might not be the immediate next step.
Yes.
Sorry, just wanted to throw that in.
No.
Yeah, I already covered so much of that. Yeah, I just want to reiterate like the joy part, and also like, I don't know. So one thing that I didn't mention earlier though, like going to Penn also was like, I mean, what was hard, right? And what I was fortunate though, like to have like a really great support system of my community. Again, I was from Philly and all that. And being able to fall back to be like, I don't want to spend so much time on campus anymore, because everything makes me feel like shit. But I have, folks outside to help me find joy, and to help me find like purpose. And that's how I even got into like youth work to begin with, because I was done with trying to do any organizing work at Penn, right? And my junior year, I was like, I'm done. What can I do? And then I started doing youth work, in summer 2013, and that's what helped me stay on the work until this year, right? 8-9 years. And really like, for folks, again, college definitely should not be the goal, like the only destination, the only thing that like, we talk about when we talk about like post high school path, right? But if it is, then like how, I think a lot of the talk about like how to get students into college, but there's not enough talk about how to help them stay in college, right? I mean, like what is the support system that would be? Like, if students choose to go outside of the where they are right now, that's great. But then like, do those places have enough of like a support system, right? Like, do we like? I don't know. It's the worst thing that could happen, right, is like for someone to be really excited about like some school, like half the country away, and going there and feeling isolated and depressed, and then feeling like shit, and then didn't have anyone to kind of fall back to, right? So I think, just to add on to a long list of things that we need to consider when we talk about like going to school, and like finding like place where folks belong, and also like stay there, or like, maybe if it's not a good fit, can we also normalize like transferring? Can we also talk about going back to things, community college, which is also like a fantastic like alternative to that as well. So yeah.
Yes, thank you for sharing all of that knowledge and experience. I know that folks were prompted in the comments to leave any questions, but I just wanted to open like one last window of opportunity for one last question. Maybe while folks are sort of like thinking if they have any questions, I just wanted to let y'all share with us like how can we follow the work that you do. And I think that folks will also be dropping some things in the chat to stay connected to y'all and your work. Oh, actually, we have a question. How can one is asking, how can teachers build relationship with parents to communicate well what students need in terms of planning for college in the future? I'm thinking about all of the parents with their own traumas about immigrating here and experiencing racism. Annie, would you be able to answer this question as a teacher?
Sure. Thank you for the question, Ms. Nguyen. I guess when I think about this, I think about my mom, right? My mom came here with all of her trauma and it's like, okay, like what did my mom need from teachers? And I don't know if she needed anything. My teachers were really supportive, but they also, real talk, my teachers were white. Like they love me, but the reality is that there's a huge cultural gap. And being able to meet my mom's needs, right, about anxieties and representation and what she saw as being possible for me, right? So even though my teachers were like, Annie's great, she'll be fine, like she's going to be successful wherever she is, we believe in her, like I was super lucky to have those things. Those were not the people to share a certain perspective with my mom. So I think part of it is like, are those adults, those caregivers also getting the resources that they need, right, to be emotionally well in order to support their child? You can't just like say things to someone, but they're like, yeah, but here's the life that we're living. We're struggling with poverty. We're going through these things. Like we see the economic instability. You have to connect people, I think, to real material resources and community support that is culturally responsive in order to really build that network for any individual child. So I think that would be my answer.
Thanks, Annie. And thank you again for all of the stories and reflections and experiences. I am so appreciative to have learned so much from y'all over the past hour and a half. I feel like my brain just like doubled in size, and you all have given me a lot to think about. Um, I believe that half folks will be dropping in the chat how to stay connected with y'all. Definitely do. And thank you so much to everyone for attending our virtual panel today. This panel was put together as a way for us to reflect and discuss the film Try Harder, which is currently screening online at PAF. And PAF this year is hybrid with more than 100 films available through streaming online and 6 in-person events held at the Asian Arts Initiative in Philadelphia's Chinatown. And you can find more about this year's festival program and purchase tickets at paff.org. Thank you all for joining us and have a lovely, lovely weekend.
Thank you, everyone.